We're at the oldest wine vineyard in South Africa, established back in 1685, and that's Groot Constantia. I hope I got that correct. Is that pretty good?
Pretty good, pretty good.
Okay.
Talon.
Pet 2 film crew, how's it going? Excellent.
So cheers.
Cheers. Oh, that is sweet.
That's baie lekker.
But that is baie lekker.
Just smell it. You that musk flavor, it's amazing.
Yeah, the aroma is amazing. Well, this is the Chief Executive Officer of Groot Constantia. This is, in fact, the oldest vineyard in South Africa, yes?
Yeah, it's the oldest surviving vineyard in South Africa. You know, the South African wine industry started in 1659 when Jan van Riebeeck wrote in his diary, today for the first time grapes was pressed in Cape Town. That was 1659, 2nd of February. Groot Constantia was established in 1685. There were other spots where vineyards were cultivated in the Western Cape and on the Cape Peninsula, but those vineyards doesn't exist anymore. So Groot Constantia was, I would say, the most significant one and also the only surviving one of these older ones.
So it's just recently celebrated its 330th anniversary.
That's correct. During its existence, it built up quite a significant list of clients, of which Louis Philippe, a French king, was one. That's just proof of the special quality that this farm was able to produce 300 years ago.
I think Napoleon also got wine from here.
Yes, the Clute family supplied him. Joseph Lusson was appointed by the English East Indian Company to source products for St. Helena. And Joseph Lusson, their agent, was married to a Clute daughter. And obviously, he purchased wine from Groot Constantia to supply Napoleon while he was on exile in St. Helena.
Now, obviously, the climate here is Mediterranean, like you find in Southern Europe.
That's correct.
And so that's probably the reason why it was a good idea. Plus, when the Cape Town was originally established by Jan van Riebeeck, it was supposed to be a refitting, resupply station to help sailors prevent getting scurvy and that sort of thing. So grapes seem to be, in this climate, a natural sort of crop.
Yes, it contains a lot of vitamin C, so it was just a natural thing to do. Alcohol is always welcome, and if you're so far away from your source of alcohol, you just start producing it yourself.
So this particular vineyard, Groot Constantia, was, if I recall correctly, established by Simon van der Stel, who's a very famous personality back in the early history of the Cape.
Simon van der Stel was the governor of the Dutch East Indian Company. It's interesting to note that in those days, it was not a government, not an established government.
But a private corporation.
Yeah, and they controlled the Cape. They appointed governors and dignitaries to rule what's happening here. And Simon van der Stel was one of the governors here, and land was granted to him in 1685. So he could have chosen any piece of land, but he chose this piece of land.
Was there a specific reason he liked this land?
It's said that he sent people out on horseback, collected soil samples and so forth. But his predecessor, Jan van Riebeeck, was trying to do grapes in the city bowl. And the summer southeaster probably destroyed his crop after season after season.
But what about the soil? Would the city bowl be kind of sandy too? That's probably not the best.
It's the same soil.
Oh, it is the same soil.
Same type of soil. But the southeaster that cools the Cape down during the hot summer months is not that strong here in Constantia. And you could have seen that on the trees. In the Western Cape, you can see all trees
are
all bent. You don't see that in Constantia.
And so this estate is nestled right up against the back of the mountain, and on the slopes here is where the vineyards are. Is the soil here particularly well suited to produce a particular type of grape?
It's decomposed granite, which is very suitable for vineyards. But the important thing about Constantia is that it's a cool climate. Due to that wind, which blows directly from the ocean, our temperatures, our midday temperatures, is about 3 to 5 degrees cooler than what you'll get in Paarl and Stellenbosch. And that is the main attribute that makes Constantia different from the rest of the South African wine industry.
The wines that you produce here, of course, consumed domestically, but you also have an export market for your wine, yes?
That's correct, yes. We export about half our production.
Is there a top market? So I'm going to guess the United States is probably a top market, or is that a false assumption?
It is a market.
It's a market, okay. Maybe not even the top market, but it's a market.
Our most important market is Germany,
Okay, well that makes
followed
sense.
by Holland. You know, it's a cultural and a historical thing. The UK, Belgium, here and there in Scandinavia, China.
That's a growing market, of course.
That's right. And the US.
We're in there somewhere.
Yeah. And then, of course, the local market. And being that old and being such a remarkable historical estate, we are a tourist attraction. And many people come and visit Groot Constantia. We receive more than 400,000 visitors through our gates every year. In a normal year now, that was before COVID.
the pandemic.
And so we sell a lot of our products from the farm, but also in other parts of South Africa.
Now, a few years back, my colleague who worked at the embassy up in Pretoria, doing the same job in South Africa that I was doing in Botswana, said, hey, when you come down for this conference, why don't we do a vineyard tour? I'm like, oh, I don't want to do a vineyard tour. Come on, man, that's, I don't want. He's like, oh, it's going to be great. You'll love it. And I did it, and he was right. But one of the things I learned about that is that vineyards down here ship their wine all over the country. There's like warehouses in Gauteng where they come from vineyards down here to store. Does Groot Constantia also do the same sort of thing? You ship your wine all over the country, so if you have a particular wine you like them here, you can get it easily somewhere else in the country?
No, that's true. You know, people come and visit us, but we obviously prefer that they buy the wine from us. But it's available. It's freely available on consumption, off consumption in the other parts of South Africa.
Are your tourists coming from all over the world? In a lot of Africa, we're seeing a lot more Chinese nationals that are doing tourism in Africa, not just investment, but tourism. But traditionally, I imagine that probably a lot of your international visitors probably come from Europe and maybe some from the U.S.?
Europe is our main source of tourism, Europe and the UK. China has developed, but COVID has sort of killed that market. I must say the US market is picking up quite nicely after COVID.
Well, that's some good news to hear. When the lockdown was instituted here in South Africa, it was a pretty serious lockdown, pretty stringent. And one of the impositions initially was that you couldn't transport alcohol. Now, for those thinking about alcohol, you're probably thinking about going to your package store or buying some beer or buying some wine. But that's just one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is for the wine industry, which ships a lot of its wine overseas to export markets. If you can't move it to port or to the airport, you're not going to be able to sell it overseas, and that could make you an unreliable supplier. Now, there was an imposition that lasted a brief period of time, but that could have been a disaster for South Africa's wine industry, do you think?
Certainly, Chris, but I think the mistake was recognized and it was rectified before any damage was done. In our case, we didn't suffer any damage due to that. The embargo was lifted before it really affected us. The major thing was the embargo on alcohol in general during that stringent lockdown periods where we were unable to sell alcohol. We could still export, but we couldn't supply the local market. And that was, especially for us, being so exposed to visitors to the estate.
And having no visitors.
And having no visitors. And you earn an extra margin by selling it from the farm.
That's actually a very good point. I think a lot of people probably don't realize is when you rely on that portion of your business model where people are coming to the property and they're buying it and you don't have a middleman, so you're not paying for transport, you're not paying for the middleman, the wholesaler's got to make money, and so more of that can be returned to the farm, and when you lose that segment, that's got to be a pretty tough situation.
It's not that you put that whole margin in your pocket, because you need staff, you need facilities to accommodate those numbers and to see to your visitors. So it's an expensive way of selling. When COVID came, we retained that staff. So your cost structures stay the same, but your income falls away.
Well, that's a fair point, because a lot of businesses made workers redundant, and of course a lot of businesses unfortunately went out of business. So you were able to keep people on staff, but obviously that had a big impact on whether your bottom line.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this question. I was not really a big red wine drinker, but I came to the Cape and I was told you should try the Cape Shiraz. And I did, and I was sold on it. So what are some of your top types of wine that you have here at the estate?
Constantia is known as a white wine area due to the cooler climate, which I explained to you. Most of the farms in Constantia has got south-facing slopes, which is cooler than other slopes. Groot Constantia has got a lot of east-facing slopes and even north-facing slopes. Here and there is south-facing slopes, and that's why Groot Constantia is basically the red wine supplier in Constantia. Shiraz is one of our main varietals. I mean, if my winemaker had free reign, he would plant the whole farm of Shiraz.
So if he had his druthers, that's all you'd have.
That's right. But we don't only have Shiraz. We produce Bordeaux varietals. The Bordeaux blend is the flagship of the estate. We produce Pinotage, which is one of the native varietal in South Africa, and obviously Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay.
Well, we're here at the estate, and this hall or building that we're in, what is this building for?
This is part of our production cellar. This is the bottom part of it, and this is where we do our barrel aging of the wines. Normally, wine would stay in these barrels for 12 months and then being renewed or refilled with the newer vintages.
Now, a lot of vineyards in Europe are very particular about the barrels and what the wood they use for it. Is that the same sort of situation here in South Africa? Are you particular about the type of wood? Does that have an impact on aging the wine?
Yeah, it's it's part of the winemaking science and winemaking art is to make use of various barrels from various suppliers, and each barrel gives you a different character. And the winemaker, by the way, our winemaker's been here now for 22 years, so he knows what kind of vineyard blocks will combine well with a certain barrel. And it's all at the end about complexity.
We talked off air a little earlier about continuity, and particularly in an industry like this, continuity for the historical knowledge, the experience is really something that comes into play. I mean, if you want to design software applications, you can just come in understanding a programming language and go in the direction you want. You don't have to have 50 years of history there necessarily. But when it comes to winemaking, continuity is probably important to your business.
That's correct. We've been in business for more than 300 years, and our aim is to be for at least another 300 years. If you look at the major changes that happened in the world after 1685, I mean, we had 2 world wars, population explosions, energy explosions, information explosions.
Oh, yeah, that one especially.
And we've survived that, and we're still around. The only thing really that's historically correct at Groot Constantia, it's change. To have survived through those years, you have to change. And in future, we will also change, but it will just be to balance ourselves out with a changing environment.
And that I think is interest to a lot of people around the world, and this is about kind of the changing landscape, if there is a changing landscape in winemaking here in South Africa, specifically non-traditional people involved in the winemaking business with vineyards. There has been the introduction by a few Black South Africans of wineries here in the Western Cape in recent history. And from my point of view, now I'm not in the wine industry, so I could be wrong. That's why I'm asking of you. From my point of view, other folks coming in probably brings different views, different attitudes, and maybe some healthy competition, but not negative, but maybe kind of the rising tide lifts all boats. And maybe it's probably just good for the wine industry in South Africa. I mean, there's certainly a big export market. So has that had an effect? Are there more non-traditional wine vintners in the area here? And is it having an impact on the industry? I would imagine positive, but if it's negative, you could share that.
No, it's certainly not negative. It's difficult to say whether you can already see the positive effect because there's only a few of them around. But what I've sensed, and that's just a personal observation that I've made, and I travel overseas once a year during normal years, is that, if you look at the world wine industry, it's mainly Europeans, white Europeans that are involved. And what I've sensed is that people are very curious to see what different cultures, what are they doing to wine? Because you have various styles across the globe, how people interpret wine, where they force wine to, and it would be very interesting to see what would their emphasis be. And that's why I say I think it's a major opportunity that we have here in South Africa is to introduce these people and to introduce more of them to really make a change.
No, that's an interesting perspective. When I was a kid, people used to ridicule California wines. And now people speak highly of many California wines, which is very interesting. I used to think about buying wine by the quart or liter in the States, but it's a very different landscape now. But that took a long time. It took decades to develop that reputation and that quality of grape that they've come up with. And I suppose that plays an aspect. I mean, you mentioned Europeans around the world, but I mean, wine, of course, has grown all over the place. Chile has wines, Australia, New Zealand. We have wine vineyards in Pennsylvania, a couple miles from my house. I think it'll take us a few more generations to get a good reputation like Groot Constantia. I don't think a Pennsylvania wine is going to get there anytime soon, but it is interesting. So I think that aspect is pretty fascinating. So let me ask you this question. You've been doing this for a long time. What's the most fascinating aspect of being in the wine industry for you? What really gets you excited about it? Or does something get you excited about it?
It starts in the vineyard.
Yeah.
And that's where the genes are being determined. And, in the wine industry, we always say a wine cell is not a hospital. It's not a place where you fix sick things. Mm-hmm. You need to start in the vineyard. And at the end, what you have in your glass is an expression of nature. And that's the point I want to make. It's an expression of that specific vineyard block, where it was cultivated, and so forth. And it's amazing if you look at the whole process.
Where do you think the future of wine is going in South Africa? Is it expanding in other places? I mean, are there going to be vineyards, or are there already vineyards in the Eastern Cape and other parts of the country?
Yeah, it's difficult to predict because there's new varietals and each varietal thrives in a different area. And we're talking about long term now, really long term. And if you look at the South African wine industry in the years of the KWV with the quota system, quotas was by district. So certain districts in South Africa didn't have a quota. So you couldn't, if you live in that district, you couldn't plant. And after the quota system was lifted, we've seen huge development in new areas, like for instance, Hermanus, Walker Bay, Agulhas, along the west coast. Those were all areas that wasn't allocated quotas in the past. There's people now, even in KZN, that's cultivating vineyards. But, for obvious reasons, it's very difficult there. But there's a lot of freedom, and certainly people will experiment, and wherever it will work, it will be a success.
There you go. We'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the topic of the Huguenots. The French Huguenots, of course, for those who aren't familiar with, they were French Calvinists who, under the Edict of Nantes, were granted religious freedom, very successful bankers, professionals, farmers, knights, nobles, all that sort of stuff. Very successful people, and very, very much people steeped in their faith. The French Huguenots, of course, the Edict of Nantes was revoked by the French king about a century later, and horrific bloodletting took place, and hundreds of thousands of refugees could get out, fled to Berlin, to the Netherlands, which was the Spanish Netherlands, I think, at the time, historically, to the United Kingdom, and all over the world. Eventually, many came to South Africa. And then you're descended from Huguenots. What impact, I imagine they had a positive impact in the wine industry, of course, coming from France. Did the Huguenots play a role, and is that an important factor in the history here?
Yeah, no, they certainly played a huge role, Chris. If you look at the town of Franschhoek, that's where they were sort of forced to settle. That's where land was granted to them in that beautiful valley. If you drive into that valley, you'll see the old Cape Dutch houses that was built by them. Just the architecture is a symbol of what they brought to South Africa. By being there in the heart of the winelands, they brought a lot of knowledge with them about wine production, but not only that, about life, about lifestyle, and so forth. Consistency was one of it. So they made a huge contribution.
Well, not just to the wine industry. Of course, the French Huguenots also contributed immensely to the language of Afrikaans and to the Afrikaner community. And you get names like Du Toit and Du Clercq and of course, your own surname, many names that come from the French origin, which for people not from South Africa, probably like, how do you get those names in South Africa? The estate is a not-for-profit. It's a private organization, but not-for-profit. But I'd like to give you a chance to make a pitch to my audience out there. Why should people come to Groot Constantia? What's on offer here? Obviously, wine, there's some tourism here. Can you just tell people what they can see when they come here?
Just to give you some background, why it's a non-profit company or not-for-profit company. When the Kloete family went bankrupt in 1885, the British government, who was in control of the Cape, they said the importance of the history of Groot Constantia is so important. They didn't want to allow it to go into private hands again. They wanted to protect it. And needless to say, the state can't run a wine estate. And at the end, what they wanted to protect it, they actually destroyed. And then for a century, they tried various models how to run Groot Constantia. The Minister of Agriculture for years stood with a red face in Parliament explaining the losses of Groot Constantia to the public or to the taxpayer. But that's the problem. You cannot run a place like this with state bureaucracy. You need to take state bureaucracy out of this. Quick decision making. And that was the main reason why in 1993 the state-owned property was transferred to a non-profit company. where we basically on a daily basis make business decisions as in a normal company, and there's only one day in the year where we run our non-profit status, and that's when we make a surplus. How are we going to distribute it? It's very clear that profit needs to be plowed back. The farm's got 2 restaurants. We've got 3 tasting rooms. We also run a museum on the farm, which is managed by Zika Museums of Cape Town and South Africa. It's a place where you need to put at least half a day aside to come and visit it and do it properly. Otherwise, you're just going to brush over it and you're not going to experience the heritage of the South African wine industry.